Is fly fishing really all that hard? Yes, casting has a learning curve to it, and learning all about aquatic insects is like learning a brand new language. But when you boil it down to its essence, fly fishing is about a really simple thing: learning to put flies in front of fish. A lot of anglers, however, overthink this sport. They make it harder than it needs to be, and they end up missing out on some of fly fishing's most rewarding moments. On today's episode of Untangled, I'll walk you through why fly fishing is actually really simple, and I'll give you a few tips to help you remember that the next time you feel overwhelmed.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone. Presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. We have an interesting show lined up for this week, and it's going to be a bit different because instead of using the opening part of this show like I usually do, where I respond to a single question or a single topic and I go really deep on it, I'm going to use this portion of the show to respond broadly to quite a few questions that we've received lately. We're still going really deep into the topic, but I'm going to try to address a lot of the questions that we've received lately, because a lot of these questions have been in the same vein, and I think it's worth addressing all of this to the VFC community at large, because the concept that I want to talk about today, if you understand this, it is going to improve your experience fly fishing more than I think anything else. This is the concept that I think a lot of the folks who've been fly fishing for so long forget that they understand this fully, but the people who are just starting out don't. Because again, when you start out in fly fishing, like I mentioned in the hook to the show, there's a lot that you've got to learn. You've got to learn how to cast. You've got to learn how to read water. Learning about insects is like learning a brand new language. Okay, there's all these words and terminology getting thrown around, and it is very easy to feel overwhelmed by all of that stuff. But what we're going to get into today is how to not overthink it, how to not let that overwhelm you to the point that you're either not enjoying it anymore or you feel like you don't know what to do, because that's not where we want to end up, right? And I do want to address, before we dive fully into this topic, that if you want to really get into fly fishing, if this is something that you're going to continue to do, you're really excited about it, then you need to be comfortable being in a state of constant learning, because this sport is going to make you do that. To my knowledge, there's not a point where you're going to get to and say, oh yeah, I know everything about fly fishing. I've got it figured out. Yeah. There's not a point where you're going to get to that you feel like you have it mastered. And I say that because I don't know a single quote unquote good angler who feels like they have it all figured out. Now, I know some folks who think they do, but are they actually good anglers? Not really. But the ones who are the best anglers I know, the fishiest guys I know, the two fishiest guys I know, they're both guides. They're exceptionally skilled. They could catch fish out of a storm drain if it came to it. But they are that good because they're always watching, they're always observing, and they are always learning. They're always trying to improve their craft. That's the mindset you've got to have. If you want to be successful at this, you've got to be willing to go into it with that kind of mindset. Now, we had Dom Swentowski on the show not too long ago. And for those who don't know, he's the man behind Trout Bitten, one of the best resources in the fly fishing world. And we talked all about nymphing for an episode. And I opened the show by introducing Dom as a fly fishing expert. And he responded, he said, well, there are no experts in fly fishing, because how can you be an expert on something that you can't ever master? Right? And I love that quote. And I love hearing that from somebody like Dom, because I would kind of consider Dom an expert, but again, Dom is an incredibly fishy guy. Now, I've never fished with him, but he's a guide. I know who he is well. Dom knows what he's doing. And if somebody at Dom's level of fishing, which I consider him head and shoulders a better angler than I am, right? If somebody at his level is like, oh, I don't have it figured out, then that should be a message to all the rest of us that we need to have that same attitude. So go into this with that attitude, and I think you're going to end up in a much better place. You're going to end up a lot more satisfied than if you go into it thinking, oh, yeah, I'm learning to fly fish this weekend. I'm going to master it, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go shoot a perfect round of golf or something, right? Like the two things that you think you could just pick up over a weekend. It's not how it is. And fly fishing at its heart, and the reason I don't think you can master it, really ever, is because it's a problem-solving endeavor. There's always going to be a new or unique or different problem to solve. You're trying to figure out what flies will get the fish to eat and how to present those flies in the most lifelike way possible. But all too often, we get caught up talking about rigs or fly selection, or we want to talk all about our gear, and we completely forget that most very basic fundamental about fly fishing. And beginners especially fall victim to this. I see it more with the beginner and intermediate beginner cohorts than just about anywhere else. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to share, a listener asked a question a while ago, and I didn't go back and pick it out. I didn't go back and look for it. It just stuck in my head for whatever reason. And there were two. One listener sent in a question that was something to the effect of, can I fish a double nymph rig in pocket water? And then another listener sent in a question that was something like, should I fish dry dropper rigs or bobber rigs in a medium-sized river? We got those questions fairly close to close. I think they were almost back to back. There's nothing wrong with those questions. I'm not throwing the listeners who asked them under the bus. I don't want any of this to come across that way, because reality is I'm very grateful that they sent those questions in, because they are the perfect springboard for us to talk about this topic and to dive into something that I think's overlooked in fly fishing, and something that I don't necessarily see this covered in other places. I see sometimes in Facebook groups or forums or whatnot that, some old guy will get on, well, fly fishing is not all that hard. Okay, to the fellow who's been doing it for 30 years, yeah, it really has become very simple, but they forget that the beginner feels so overwhelmed, right? They forget that these things we understand innately. Oh, yeah, that's a seam. That's a run. That's a riffle. Oh, it's March. The fish are going to be feeding on midges. Maybe there's some blue wings out. All those little things that become ingrained if you do this for a long enough time. The older folks forget that. And I'm not throwing older folks under the bus either. I'm just saying there's a disconnect, right? There's the, oh, this is super simple. And then the beginners, this is not simple. I'm drinking from a fire hose and I think I'm going to drown, right? Both are valid points. You get there. And again, there's nothing wrong with the questions that got asked. That's why VFC exists, for crying out loud. That's why this podcast exists, is to answer these questions. But I wanted to use those two questions specifically because, again, they're the perfect springboard to dive into this topic. So let's look at that first question. Can I fish a double nymph rig in pocket water? Well, I'm going to answer that question with a question. Can you? I'm not being a jerk. I'm legitimately asking, can you? Is there some law in fly fishing that says, oh, double nymph rig in pocket water? Durrant says nay. No, there's not. Now, I bet what that listener meant was something to the effect of, is it a good idea to fish a double nymph rig in pocket water? To which my response is still going to be the same. Question. Is it a good idea? Think for a minute. What are you trying to achieve with that double nymph rig? You're drifting two nymphs beneath an indicator deeper in the water column because you believe that's where the fish are hanging out. That's where they're eating. And 90% of the time when we're talking about trout, that's true because something like 90% of a trout's diet is nymphs. They only eat dry flies a very small amount of the time. They spend most of their time underwater eating nymphs. That's what they're doing. So would it be a good idea, with that knowledge in mind, to use a double nymph rig in pocket water? Yeah, it probably would be a good idea. But by asking that question, you're overcomplicating the whole issue because that's not the question you should be asking, right? The question you should be asking is the simplest one. So when you boil fly fishing down to its essence, this is the question you're trying to solve. This is the problem you're trying to find a solution for when you go fly fishing, and that is, how can I most effectively and naturally put my flies in front of a fish? That's it. That's the only question you need to ask yourself. You don't need to worry about rigs. You don't need to worry about if you've done it right. How can I most effectively and naturally put my flies in front of a fish? You answer that question, everything else falls into place. Because there's almost no instance in fly fishing where you're going to look at a situation and say, oh, there's only exactly one way to accomplish the task of getting my flies naturally in front of this fish. The only time where you might be restrained or constricted to just a couple of options is maybe during a hatch where the fish are really keyed in on dry flies. And that's a situation where, yeah, you might just need to use one style of fly. You might just need to use dry flies in that instance. But you can present that dry fly multiple ways. You can do an upstream drift. You can do a downstream drift. Or you can even tie on a soft hackle and swing it, because oftentimes during a dry fly hatch, that's a fantastic way to go to put some more fish in the net. There's certainly not ever going to be just one type of water where you roll up to that type of water and, oh, if I don't fish it this way, I'm not going to catch a fish. You have to look at every situation through the prism of that one very simple question. How do I effectively and naturally put my flies in front of a fish? The way I accomplish that, the way I problem solve that, is with a dry dropper rig about 70% of the time. I run double nymph rigs during the winter or during high water situations, but other than that, I'm fishing a dry dropper. I really like to have the opportunity to catch fish on a dry fly. That's what I love the most. But I run that dropper because, again, something like 90% of a trout's diet is subsurface, so they're going to move for that nymph, and I know that. I want to put fish in the net, so I run that nymph. Now, the second question that I mentioned earlier, let's get into that. The second question that spawned this whole rant. Not really a rant. That's the wrong word for it. This discussion. The second question was, should I fish dry dropper rigs or bobber rigs in a medium-sized river? Well, let's apply the same principles we just got done discussing to that question. First off, though, what qualifies as a medium-sized river? We don't really have a standard way of referring to rivers in the fly fishing world, which is ironic because we've got streams and creeks and brooks and sloughs and rivers. We've got tons of names for moving water. We really should standardize things at some point. Like, a river is X feet across, and if it's smaller than that, it's a stream or something. But more importantly than that, why does the size of the river even matter? Again, not being a jerk with that question, I'm trying to get you to think. Why does the size of the river matter? Why would that impact what rig you use? My local tailwater is what a lot of anglers would consider a bigger river, and I fish it almost exclusively with a dry dropper rig. I run double nymphs in the winter, dry dropper the rest of the time. That's it. Big water can be intimidating. Bigger water than what you're used to can be intimidating because a lot of beginners think that the fish are everywhere and they get overwhelmed. They see all that water, they think the fish are everywhere, but they're not. They're holding in that same kind of water that you've learned about, in the same places that they hold in smaller water. Seams, riffles, pools, and runs. That's where the fish are going to be. That's where they're at in the smaller water. That's where they're going to be in the bigger water. They're not in those big rapids in the middle of the river like the class 5s or, well, class 5, that's pretty dramatic. Let's go to class 3s or class 2s and 3s. They're not in that rapid. They might be right next to it. If there's a good seam or a pocket right next to the rapid, there's definitely going to be trout there. I've caught some really fun, really nice fish out of these seams and pockets directly next to the rapids. So they could be right next to that fast water, but they're not going to be in it. They're not going to hold there. That's a terrible place to hold and eat food. Okay? So let's go back to that medium-sized river. Let's say you roll up to the river. We don't care what size the river is because the fish are holding in those same places. Yes, you do need to know those places. You do need to understand that. You really want to to move on and fly fishing, you've got to have an understanding of that stuff. But let's assume that you've got that. Okay. Let's go back to that medium-sized river. Are the fish eating off the top? If they are, tie on a dry fly or a dry dropper rig. That's a fantastic way to get to it. But if they're not actively rising, a bobber rig would be an excellent choice. But again, we come to those conclusions by answering that question. How can I most effectively and naturally put my flies in front of a fish? If the fish are rising, they're telling you right there they want a dry fly. Boom. Dry fly, dry dropper, an emerger, wet fly, something up in the surface of the water. That's what they're looking for. That's what they're keyed in on. And if they're not rising, they're probably eating nymphs. It's that simple. Most anglers, even beginners, okay, maybe if you're brand new, like brand new, you've not even caught a fish on a fly rod yet, you might not have the tools at your disposal to answer this question, but most anglers and most beginners do. Okay, if you've been in this 3-4 months and you've caught a few fish, but you're still feeling frustrated, you're feeling overwhelmed, you feel like you're not quite getting it, things aren't clicking, you have the tools at your disposal to answer that question. And you can solve a ton of all those frustrations that you're feeling by boiling everything down to that single goal. The reason that we have all these different rigs, the reason the different ways exist to present your flies is to accomplish that goal of putting flies in front of fish in a natural way. But even, and it's funny because even among anglers who've been doing this for a while, we don't always problem solve it the same way. And that's what I don't want you guys to get hung up on. Because a lot of beginners can get hung up on like, oh, well, I've got to match the rig, and I'll address this later, but you can't get hung up on that. Okay? Give you a story to illustrate this example. A couple of years ago, Alex and I, this was right after I moved to Wyoming, we were on a river here together, and the water was a little bit higher than we thought it would be. It wasn't like runoff or anything. It was just high. So Alex busted out some split shop and some bobbers and put together a nymph rig. He nymphed a long seam. He put a few fish in the net. I think a couple whitefish, a couple trout, if I remember correctly. Well, I didn't want to fish with nymphs. A big surprise to anybody who's listened to the show before. I wanted to fish dry flies. So I tied on a big dry fly because A, I wanted to fish it, but B, there were a bunch of stone flies out there crawling all through the bushes and whatnot. So I walked the banks of the river. I was looking for pockets of calm water. And when I found those, I would cast my fly into them, and I hooked in a fish on the dry fly in those pockets of calm water. Alex and I were fishing the exact same river, but I problem solved completely different than he did. Alex opted for that heavier nymph rig because that's the most effective way to put fish in the net when you're faced with high water. That really is. That's a great way to go for it. I opted for the dry fly because I know that during high water, when the water comes up, it pushes the fish to the banks, and you can find a lot of them holding tight to the banks because there's usually some slower water there. And then with all those stone flies out, I knew, okay, this is a really good opportunity for me to go ahead and get some fish on dry flies. And I was proven right. I was talking with Alex about this yesterday, about this show, and he said he actually remembers that because he told me, he's like, I learned something on that trip because he never would have thought of fishing that big dry fly that close to the banks during that high water. He would have just always gone nymphs on the seams and gone for it, which is what he did. But now that he saw me do that, saw me catch fish, he's got that experience in his memory bank and another opportunity, another way, another tool to use to fish water next time he gets into something like that. Now, again, the point of telling that story is to illustrate that you shouldn't let all the options that you have in front of you paralyze you into inaction. I see that a lot with beginners. This is what I was mentioned before I told the story, where the beginners get out there and they feel like they've got to match their rig to the water, and they start overthinking everything they're doing. They're worried so much about, well, is my rig exactly right? Did I use 20 inches of tippet where I should have used 18? Did I tie a blood knot instead of a surgeon? Should I have used a loop knot instead of a clinch knot? They start questioning every tiny little detail that really doesn't matter. It really doesn't. because your whole goal is get the fly in front of the fish. Okay, don't worry about matching the rig and doing it perfectly. Get your fly in front of the fish. Keep it simple, because at its root, fly fishing is simple. Yes, the mechanical process of casting and managing line, that's not simple. Anybody who tells you, oh yeah, fly casting's a piece of cake, anybody can do it. Yeah, anybody can do it, anybody can learn, but piece of cake, I don't agree with that. I was just teaching a friend of mine to fly fish over the weekend, and we're going through the casting and whatnot, and he picked it up quicker than a lot of other folks I teach, but it still took him 20, 30 minutes. I wouldn't ever call it easy. It's different. It's not insurmountably hard. Yeah, I'm not trying to say that it is, but it's certainly not easy. Okay? Managing line, that's not super simple either. But what you're trying to accomplish with your flies and your fly rod, that is simple. And when you lose sight of that, that's when you start running into these problems. Okay? Something else that Alex wanted to add when we were talking about this, it's absolutely vital, and it's going to help you out if you have a bunch of different tools in your tool belt. Okay, knowing different rigs, how to cast, how to find fish, how to read your water. But that all comes with experience, and understanding that, having all those tools in your tool belt is what separates the really great anglers from the rest of us, who are just trying to figure it out. Comes with time, comes with a lot of effort put into it. And when you have all those experiences, you're able to see options and know what will work best in that situation. The only way to gain that is with reps and experience out on the water. As you learn and grow in the sport, you're going to learn new ways to fish. You're going to learn new techniques. You're going to refine those techniques. But they're all working to accomplish that same goal. Put a fly effectively and naturally in front of a fish. That's the only thing you're trying to do. And if you lose sight of that, you are going to get frustrated. If you lose yourself in the weeds, it's only going to end up in frustration. So the next time you're out there in the water, you're feeling overwhelmed, you think, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't figure this out. Take a step back. Ask yourself, how do I effectively and naturally put a fly in front of a fish? You answer that question, it's going to simplify things quite a lot for you. I really hope that helped. I really hope I was able to communicate that well. Again, I'm really grateful for the questions that we got that allowed me to have this discussion. And I'm grateful for all the questions that we get from everybody, from all our listeners and viewers that allow us to have these discussions to help us learn more, learn different rigs, learn different ways to accomplish that task of effectively and naturally putting flies in front of fish. Now, if there's anything I said during this portion of the show that you need some clarification on, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. But it's time to move on to the next part of the show. We've got the Q&A section of the show coming up. So grab a Diet Coke, get comfortable, because there is a lot more content coming your way.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
If you're new to Untangled this week, first off, welcome to the greatest fly fishing podcast ever made. And second, every week we do a Q&A section on the show where I answer questions submitted from our viewers and listeners here at Untangled. And if you ever want a question answered, there's always a link in the podcast description to send those questions on in. And Untangled runs off of your questions. We don't have a podcast if we don't have questions being asked by the listeners and viewers. So please don't hesitate to send those in. And our first question this week comes to us. Chris from New York writes in and says, just recently found the show and love it. Started with episode 1 and I'm working my way to the most current. Learning a lot and can't wait for more content. My question is, can you help me understand all the actions of fly rods and which ones are for certain types of fishing situations, or are they just preferences, tight lines? Chris, thanks for the question. And I'm glad you're listening to the show. Hopefully you're still listening. I know some of the early episodes, I go back and listen to them. I'm like, man, that was a rough time. You learn a lot as a podcaster. And, sometimes I feel bad about the first episodes. But hopefully you stuck around, Chris. We actually did an entire episode about fly rod design, understanding rods. We did that with the head rod designer at the R.L. Winstead Rod Company, Hank Hain, sat down with us. So if you want to hear all about rod actions from somebody who really knows his stuff, definitely go check that episode out. I'll link that in the show notes so you can hear more about that. But I'll still give you my non-expert version. I'm just a fly rod enthusiast about fly rod action. What it really boils down to is action is just a word we use to describe how much of the rod flexes during the cast. So a fast action rod, it's going to flex mostly in the tip section, while a medium fast rod is going to flex in maybe that first third to the first half of the rod, depending on who's making it and the design that they've got in mind for it. And then a slow action rod is going to flex from the tip of the rod all the way down into the cork grip. So that rod's just going to move. Generally, a rod that's slower in action is meant to flex and load deeply so that it can still muster enough energy to throw a tight loop at short distances while still keeping things nice and accurate. Fly rods, for those who don't know, they're designed to flex and transfer energy into the fly line. And then that fly line is meant to form loops as it travels through the air. Tight loops are accurate loops, so the tighter loop that you have, the more accurate cast you're going to end up with. A medium fast rod's not going to flex as deeply, so it might not be as good at shorter distances as a slow rod, but it's still going to work well. You just might not have the same feel and control that you would with that slower rod. A fast action rod doesn't flex very much at all compared to a slow rod, but it's got a little bit more stiffness and power that lets it punch line out very quickly to your average trout fishing distance, 20, 30 feet. You can really punch that out super quick with a fast rod, and takes a few more casting strokes to do that with the slow rod. I personally prefer medium fast rods for all of my trout fishing because it gives me enough delicacy in close that I can make short casts with smaller dry flies and I can handle those well. But then it still has enough power to punch bigger rigs out to longer distances. A lot of anglers, though, they really love, trout anglers especially, really love fast rods because they're generally a bit easier to cast. They're more forgiving of bad casting technique. So if you're just learning and you're still refining your casting technique, a faster rod can help. And then they have more power to fight through the wind. I'd say for trout fishing, though, it really does come down to preference. There's no rod action that's going to be quote-unquote better than another. Softer rods are generally geared more towards small stream dry fly fishing. So if you do a lot of that kind of fishing, it's definitely worth checking out a soft, slow rod because you might get more enjoyment from that. If a lot of your casts are, 15-ish feet, you've got to make a really accurate but still delicate presentation. A slow rod's going to help you out quite a bit there. So hopefully that cleared things up for you, Chris. And if you got any other questions about that, or if you need more clarification on your question, please don't hesitate to let me know. Micah from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, quick question today. What is the best way to pack/store a fly rod and reel? Should I take off the reel and rod and store the rod in its tube? Or do they make tubes that have a place for a reel to stay attached to the rod? Are those okay? Want to protect my investment as best I can. Thanks." Micah, thanks for the question, and thank you for sending that in. We've actually had a few questions about like storing our gear and taking care of it, so I appreciate you sending that in. When my rods aren't in my truck, they're in the rod tube, in my office / fly tying room / podcast room / guest bedroom. They're in the tubes, sitting there. If I'm not fishing, that's where they are. I always take the reel off and I store those. I've got a reel bag where I put all my reels, because none of the rod tubes that I own have the little space to keep the reel attached. So I just take the reel off. But the new rod tubes for our fly flinger here at VFC, we actually have the room to keep the reel attached. A lot of folks love the utility of them. I love it too. It's a nice little feature. The big thing to remember with storing your gear, it doesn't really matter if you keep the reel attached or not. That's not going to make a difference at all. But the number one thing is don't put your gear away wet, especially your fly rod. Right? I have a dozen Winston rods. I've got a bit of a love affair with Winston, and my favorite of all of them is my 9'5" weight B3X. I love that rod, and I was fishing with that rod a few years ago. No, it wasn't a few years ago. It was less than that. Anyways, I was fishing with my rod at some point, and I put it away wet. I didn't think twice about it. Put it away wet. Went to grab it a couple of days later. I opened the rod tube, and this stench of mildew just spilled forth, and I about choked to death. And my poor rod, the mildew had gotten into all the thread wraps, had clouded them all over. And then on top of that, it had actually worn away the inscription, and it had swollen. The moisture got into the reel seat insert, swollen it up to the point where the sliding band on the reel seat wouldn't even move up and down. It was bad. I ruined the rod because I put it away wet. And I sent it into Winston to get repaired. It took them 3 months, which not complaining. That's kind of typical for warranty work these days with a lot of the rod companies. And I was without my favorite rod for 3 months while the warranty work was done. Now, the rod looks beautiful. They took wonderful care of me. Very, very happy with the warranty experience. But you don't want to be out your rod, right? That's not good, especially when it's your fault. Okay, you don't want to be out the rod because you made the mistake. So don't put your fly rod away wet. You don't want to do it. You also never want to store fly line when it's dirty either. I clean my lines about twice a year now. I used to never clean my lines. I started cleaning them, and it makes an enormous difference in how long they last. It's stupid. I can't believe I didn't clean my lines before. But if I'm out fishing somewhere and I get a lot of dirt or sand on my line or in my reel, then I'll clean it again that night when I get home. And I'll just leave the reel and the line sitting on the counter to dry. Just set it next to the dishes and let it dry, and then put it back in the reel bag. So don't store stuff wet. Make sure it's clean. You should be in good business. Thanks for sending that question in, Mike. I appreciate it. Mike from Pennsylvania writes in and says, I'm thinking of treating myself to a new fly rod, and I would like to know if you believe a $700+ fly rod will make the experience exponentially better than a $250 rod. Or does it simply confer pride in ownership and a sense of superiority? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Mike, I appreciate how you phrased that question. Thank you. And I think if you ask this question 10 different anglers, you probably get 10 different answers, to be completely honest with you. My 2 cents is that's what you asked for. The more expensive rods are almost always the best tools currently available on the market. But there's no way around it. Yes, the price is ridiculous. The fact that we're paying $1,300 for some fly rods right now, I mean, I can't believe they're there, but it's a big price. It's a big ask, but they're also the best tools on the market, right? Where they're better than cheap rods, though, performance-wise, really comes down to they're lighter. They often give you a bit more feedback during the cast, so you can feel the cast better. You can feel a bit more when your nymphs are drifting, for example. You get more feedback through the rod. It's more sensitive, and that helps a lot in different fishing situations. And then they're also inherently more accurate. Now, most accuracy comes down to your ability as a fly caster. I could give you the new Orvis Helios that they say is the most accurate rod they've ever built. I could give you that rod, and if you don't know how to cast, you're not going to be very accurate with it. But when fly rod companies talk about their rods being the most accurate we've ever made, what they mean is they've eliminated as many of the variables as they can in the fly rod that can impact accuracy. Because fly rods, they don't just move straight in a straight line when you're casting them. They're 9 feet long. They have a little side-to-side wobble, which we call oscillation, or a lack of torsional stability, where they don't always move in that really nice straight line. They don't track perfectly straight. Okay, the rods, though, that can eliminate as much of that side-to-side movement, that oscillation as possible, and can get the tip of their rod to stay in as straight a line as possible, those rods are inherently more accurate because That tip moving in a straight line means that your loops of fly line are going to be straighter and tighter. And just like we learned a few minutes ago, tight loops are accurate loops. So if you're able to get a rod that does that, you are going to see an increase in accuracy if you know how to cast and you know how to be accurate with your fly cast. So you will see a big difference there compared to some of the cheaper rods. Expensive fly rods also tend to be finished with nicer components, better cork. Sometimes they have much better warranties than cheaper rods, but that doesn't impact how the rod fishes at all. So I was just focusing on, how it fishes. Some cheaper rods, you might find some that are really nice and light, that feel light in your hands. They're not too heavy. They might have really great feedback, and they can be very accurate. There are some very great cheap rods that exist. There are some excellent sticks in that $250 to $500 range, which isn't cheap, but it's not out of the realm of possibility for a lot of us. Okay? There's some in that range that are excellent sticks. And then there's plenty of rods under the $250 mark that are still really good beginner rods, really good for getting your feet wet in this sport. Now, I fish with our fly flinger a lot here at VFC, and I still review tons of fly rods for a couple of magazines. And I don't know that I wouldn't personally say, like, if I've got our fly flinger and then I switch to my Winston, for example, I don't know that I would say the experience with the Winston is exponentially better. It's better, but exponentially is the wrong word. I definitely noticed that the Winston's lighter. The fly flinger is not a heavy rod, but the advances in rod design at the high end, it's amazing how light some of these rods can be. That's really going to be what you notice. It's a more effective experience, I would say. Instead of exponentially better, I think it's more effective. Probably the best way to look at it. I don't personally think that you're missing out on any added joy or added fun to your fishing if you don't have an expensive rod. I do personally believe they're worth the investment. If you're going to fly fish a lot and you're going to keep doing this for the rest of your life, get yourself a nice rod. You're going to be happy that you did. Alex disagrees with me on this, so maybe we need to get his thoughts on this topic. He's hashtag fly flinger for life. And the fly flinger is a great rod. As far as just not even just a beginner rod, it's a great rod. It's got a medium fast action. It works well. I fish it consistently. And like I said, I just think you get a more effective experience with an expensive rod compared to cheaper rods. I wouldn't say exponentially better. So hopefully that helped. I appreciate you sending the question on in. Thank you. Cody from West Virginia has got our next question. Writes in and says, I just got into fly tying and just finished up the masterclass videos, which have helped tremendously. I was wondering if y'all had any more pointers on applying dubbing. It always feels like I put way too much on. My hare's ears look more like pocket lint than a bug. Cody, man, you have no idea how many times I asked myself that exact same question when I started tying flies. I've been there, and I'll be honest, I am sometimes still in that situation where I put too much dubbing on, so don't feel bad. The best advice I can give you is what I was given that made the biggest difference to me is take the amount of dubbing that you plan on using, split that amount in half, then cut that amount in half, and you're probably at the right amount of dubbing for your fly. It takes so little dubbing. Okay, it really, like, half what you're going to use and half it again, and that's probably close to what you need. It's always, also, you got to remember, too, that it's always easier to add dubbing than to remove it. So always err on the side of not enough, then you can always add more. Removing it can be kind of tough. A good way to think of it, I know a few tires, I want to say, I think Charlie Craven says this, and I think Tim Flagler says this. Or Flagler. I can never remember how to say your name, Tim. Obviously Tim's going to listen to the podcast. I'm sorry for butchering your last name. I'm sorry. He's tightline videos on YouTube. If you've watched any of his tying videos, he'll say you just want to dirty the thread with the dubbing, and I like that visual. It helps me remember. Just get it dirty. You don't want to add too much bulk to the thread. You want the thread to still be as close to the same diameter as possible. You just want it covered to the point where you can't see the thread anymore through the dubbing. On most nymphs as well, I don't make my dubbing noodle longer than about 2 inches at the most. That ensures I'm not using too much as well. So add less dubbing than you think you need, and then make that dubbing noodle about 2 inches long at the max, and you should be in really good shape. Now that wraps up the Q&A section for this week's show, but don't go away because we still have the live real life moment coming up next. And just in case you're new to the show or you haven't been keeping up on recent episodes, this is a brand new segment to Untangled where every week we are going to share a picture and a story of success, or even a video. I think, was it last week's episode we shared a video? I believe it was. But the idea is we want to give time to highlight the folks in the VFC community who are living real life. That's our hashtag and our motto here at VFC, hashtag live real life, where you're out on the water and you're having fun, you're experiencing the sport, you're getting into it, or maybe you're struggling, you're learning something. We want to hear about those successes. We want to hear about those experiences, and we want to share them with the rest of the community because, as we know, we learn the best when we learn from each other, and we can all help each other be better anglers. So I love to get these stories of success to share with everybody. There's a link to send your live real life moments into us at the show. It's in the podcast description. You go check it out. And this week's live real life moment comes to us from Jeff, who's located in Maryland. He sent in the story, and then he's got a picture as well. If you're watching the podcast, you'll see the picture up on YouTube. And if you're just listening to us, I put the picture in the podcast description for you. So Jeff's story. This is not a trophy fish by most people's opinions, but it's a momentous fish for me. I've only been fly fishing for a little over a year. Been learning, and you guys have been invaluable with your masterclass and your podcast. I just got your ultimate fly collection today. It's fantastic, so thanks. Anyways, back to the fish. I live in Baltimore, and our Blue Ribbon River here is the Gunpowder River, a 55-degree tailwater north of the city. It's a very technical fishery, since it's not a huge river and all the browns are native, so wary. So stealth and cunning and knowing how to cast and choosing the right fly all are key. After being skunked on my first 4 trips, totaling probably over 20 hours, 2 days before I caught this fish, I finally landed 2 very small browns and an 8-inch rainbow. Buoyed by those winds, I ventured out at dawn on this day and was being handed my hat for an hour or so again by a river that seemingly didn't want to relinquish its fish, to me anyway. I had a dry dropper set up on that had produced my last trip's 3 catches, but nothing. I crossed paths with another angler who said he'd had 3 fish on but hadn't landed them. I asked what he was using, and he said he was fishing ints since the oppressive heat apparently called for that. Who knew? So 10 minutes later, I swapped out my rig for the closest thing I had, a foam beetle. I read the water correctly, identifying a little seam just below a riffle where I just knew a fish had to be hanging out. On my second cast, this 11-inch brownie just chomped on that beetle, like the slow-mo you guys show in your vids. I wasn't more than 15 feet away, so the struggle was neither mighty nor long, but I used your techniques that are a view in my mind each outing before I start fishing for landing him and using the rod, not the tip, like I need that with this fish, and brought him quickly and effortlessly to my net. Like I said, not a trophy, but for a beginner, and in this particular river, I was so happy and so grateful to you guys. There are 20 inches in the gunpowder. I can actually see some in certain holes not far from where this happened, and I know I'll cross their paths one day. But on this particular day, with some help from my fellow angler downstream, I picked the right fly, read the water, and had a decent presentation and didn't mess up reeling him in. The culmination, I would catch 2 more smalls that day with no disappointment. Sorry for the tone, but you said we could go in depth. Thanks for all you do for the fishing community. Keep up the great work. Tight lines. Don't worry about the length there, Jeff, at all. It's a wonderful story. I love it. It's fantastic. Those days when you just figure it out and getting help from other anglers, that's always a plus too. But those days when you just figure it out, you push through, you put some fish in the net, those are the days you remember. Those are the days that help you learn. And those are the days that help you bring everything back to the simple question we talked about at the beginning of the show. How do I effectively and naturally put my flies in front of a fish? So wonderful story, Jeff. Thank you so much for sending that in. And with that, folks, we have reached the end of yet another week and excellence in podcasting here at Untangled. Thank you so much for listening. If you could, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more visible the show gets, and the more anglers we can help have a great day on the water, and the more stories we get to share with everybody else. And that's what we're doing here at VFC and at Untangled. If you've got a question for the show, please do not hesitate to send those in. There's always a link to do that in the podcast description. And your live real life moments, we want to hear about them. We want to hear your stories of success out there on the water. Please don't hesitate to submit those either. There's the link in the show notes for that. And until next week, everybody, get out there on the water, have some fun, and tight lines.